A very warm welcome. We are about to start an expert webinar on alternative recommender systems and the Digital Services Act. My name is Katarzyna Szymielewicz, and I will have the pleasure to moderate this discussion. On behalf of all organizers, Panoptykon Foundation, European Partnership for Democracy, Access Now, and Article 19, I welcome our online audience and wonderful speakers. Here with us today, we have Ian Brown, a researcher in interoperability and data protection, formerly Oxford Internet Institute, now visiting professor at FGV. Welcome, Ian. Cory Doctorow, journalist, science fiction author, and special advisor to Electronic Frontier Foundation. Welcome, Cory.
Hello.
Great to have you here. Mark Fadul, expert in artificial intelligence, formerly at Berkeley School of Information, now creating better alternatives at youchoose.ai. Welcome.
Hello.
Kim van Sparentak, member of the European Parliament from the Greens IFA group, one of the most progressive voices in Brussels on regulating online platforms. Thank you for accepting the invitation, Kim.
Thank you.
Last but not least, Maria Luisa Stasi, Senior Legal Officer at Article 19, expert on free expression and a strong voice in favor of unbundling online platforms.
Hi.
Thank you, Maria. Hi. I could not imagine, honestly, a better combination of expertise for our deep dive into the topic of alternative recommender systems, because this is what we have planned for today. But let me start with a very brief explanation of why, as organizers of this webinar, we chose to focus on recommender systems, or more specifically on algorithms that are responsible for suggesting content on very large platforms, as probably the most serious problem that needs to be addressed by the EU when regulating large online platforms. A short answer to this question is because recommender systems controlled by companies that run on advertising profits, as it is the case right now, shape our information diet and our public debate in a way that benefits advertisers and online platforms' business model, but harms us and our societies. We already know that algorithms optimize for engagement amplify toxic content, such as hate speech and disinformation, and target humans based on their vulnerabilities, including mental disease, health-related issues, anxieties. Documents that were revealed by Frances Haugen did not reveal this problem. It was known long before, but Facebook files gave us confirmation that we are talking about not a bug, but about a feature of recommender systems funded by advertising. In other words, Facebook's extremely profitable recommender system comes at a very high price paid by vulnerable individuals and our societies. Now, with the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act, the whole package in the making, we have a rare opportunity to solve this problem. So now is the time to reimagine recommender systems that will deliver value and not cause harm. Recommender systems that will advance fair competition, enable democratic debate, and truly respect users' preferences. We are not naive. We do believe that such systems are possible, and we are going to prove that today. This panel will talk about the promise and the technology behind what we call alternative recommender systems, starting from the very basics. The first voice on the panel, Maria Luisa. Article 19 advocates for unbundling large online platforms in exactly to do that, to create space for what you call alternative recommender systems. Can you explain this concept and tell us what is the promise behind it, why we need to move in this direction?
Sure. Thank you, Kasia, for the kind introduction. And hi, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be part of this discussion. I'm going to take just a couple of minutes to sort of throw the main ideas behind our proposal, and then I'm going to be very happy to take not only questions afterwards, but also to listen to what all these fantastic panelists will have to say. So basically, let's start from the status quo. So you rightly highlighted how important recommender systems are and what are the main challenges about this. So out there today, the recommender systems, those services, they come as a bundle. Every time a user joins a large social media platform, it needs to take the entire package, the hosting, the content curation, which is what the recommended systems do, and possibly another number of services, instant messaging, and so on and so forth. So they don't have a choice. They get in and they get all at once, which means that they are also locked into those services. And it means that from a platform perspective, this makes a lot of sense, a lot of business and economic sense. Why so? Because once the user is in, then there is no competition at any layer of these services. So they shield themselves from competition by bundling all those services together. Their narrative is that this sort of facilitates or makes them able to provide a better user experiences. But then if we look at users and what actually happens to them in this situation, it's not necessarily the case. Because users, they have no choice and they have no power. They have no power to define which criteria are being used to shape their newsfeed or similar. They have no power in negotiating which kind of criteria are used to protect their data while they use these services. And they have no option. If they're not happy with that, they will need to stay with that service as well, in any case, or leave it all. And if they leave it all, it comes at expenses as well, because those services are now a fundamental part of our communication environment, especially especially considering that we're talking about a very few large platforms, and it's a way to access content, to stay in touch with people. So it's very much a fundamental element of our communication infrastructure. So this is the status quo, but it's not necessarily the way it should work. And in fact, it's not technically the way it should work. And it's not, there is also no legislation that basically obliges platforms to use the bundle. It's just a very, very good economic strategy. And I think that DSA offers a great opportunity to change this status quo. With minor tricks on a couple of articles, what we could do and what we think is the best solution, we could open up the market for recommended system. We could oblige the large platform to unbundle the hosting and the content curation, and we could stimulate the entrance into the market of a variety of players that can provide their own recommended system to the users, and we can empower users to make a choice from the very beginning. When they join a platform, a social media platform, they can decide if the newsfeed needs to be provided by the same platform or by another service provider. Those parameters are considered better by the individual user. And they can make the choice not only at the beginning, but they can actually switch every time they want. This is the goal that we want to achieve. They can select the service that can fit best their needs, and they can switch anytime they are unsatisfied, every time there is a new service on the market that is more attractive. And on the other side, this is going to stimulate competition, and the variety of players, they will need to compete among themselves. They will need to innovate. They will need to provide a better quality services. And by better quality, it means that they will diversify their offer. They will use different criteria to select which kind of content needs to be prioritized or demoted. They will need to use different criteria with regards to the respect of the privacy of the users and so on and so forth. So let's say two main goals at once. We have more competition and innovation. We have users empowerment, but we also have another third goal that we can achieve with this instrument, which is we can diversify and decentralize the environment. The fact that only few large platforms, they have all this power on our information diets and on the flow of information in society through the control of those recommended systems is definitely not good for society and for democracy. So what we can do if we diversify the environment is also dilute this power. And this will create a communication infrastructure, which I think is way more in line with our democratic values. I'll stop it here as an introduction. I'm very curious to hear what the other things, and happy to take questions afterwards. Thank you.
If we have immediate comments from the panel on the value and the promise behind this solution, here is the time to give me your show of hand or nodding. Okay, I already see Kim, and actually I wanted to call for Kim to add a few lines on the importance of increasing diversity in this market of recommender systems. Why would we need that also from societal and not only individual perspective? Kim, over to you.
Thank you so much. And I think that Maria Luisa already gave a very good explanation. But what I think when we're talking about, what kind of opportunity it gives, it also gives us the opportunity to re-envision the internet. The internet started as this creative place to exchange information, bring people together. And today it's just a very few, very large online platforms that are sort of deciding what our internet looks like. And also we almost can't imagine any other way of the internet functioning anymore. And next to that, unfortunately, we also see that it has a very bad effect on our society, exactly as was mentioned before, that was revealed already by the Hagen revelations. And we already had quite a lot of ideas about that before. So I think, the opportunities are there to really reshape the internet and, make it a better and safer place for everyone. But perhaps building on that and also answering to your question, I think our societies have become also completely dependent on big tech for exchange of information. And this gives them huge power over our freedom of expression and which ideas actually do reach people and which not. So I think we need to break free of the big tech myth that this is simply the system and it's this way or nothing at all. So I also think that the big tech myth of us getting a graveyard of startups if we fundamentally change the current system is something that we have to get rid of, because it's all complete nonsense. We have alternatives. There are alternatives. And that's why it's so important that we now create rules where these alternatives get the space that they deserve to create an environment and of creativity and creating ethical competition. Because, the whole scare of, getting rid of the toxic business models that we have right now is of course completely nonsense, because if you can come up with a toxic business model, perhaps you're also good at coming up with a more privacy friendly and healthy business model. So I think that the most important thing of diversifying the system is to create many more alternatives to toxic algorithms. And I think that we need to create a space for alternatives to compete. And that's why it's really important to make it obligatory for consumers to have the option and to access alternative ways to have content recommended to them. Next to that, I think people must be able to reach, alternative ways of recommender systems and content moderation, and they must be accessible. And, we're really living under a threat of, our online public space being decided on and being shaped by a very small group of shareholders that are only looking at profit. And we have to change this system, but we can only do this if users have the right to know what they are getting recommended online and why. And we have to give them more control over what they see and what they want to see. Thank you.
Thank you. I can't agree more with that vision and that value proposition. I'm just a little bit worried that we need a strong business model behind this for delivering this promise in the real world. And we also need users, people, humans, us willing to take more responsibility, willing to use services that expect much more activity on their side, much more choices. And here I want to call Mark, because Mark, you and YouChoose.ai and you there in this company, you experiment with alternatives, you experiment with offering people that kind of choice. What is your take on it? How you think the new business model will land? What will make it economically viable? And what will attract people to your type of services?
Yeah, I think that the claim that quality recommendation and sustainable business models can only be achieved by exploiting user data is untruthful. So the platform are promoting this idea because it's the model they have chosen and they want data exploitation to remain the dominant paradigm. But quality recommendation can be provided without personalization, particularly when it comes to related recommendations. So personalized recommendations are mainly beneficial for the platform because They keep attracting users to clickbaity video or attention-catching ones, which are tailored to their kinks. So for me, for example, it's climbing video. Even if I watch a video on a Python package, there'll always be a climbing video in my YouTube recommendation, and every other time I'll get distracted and click on it. And so this data exploitation is at the service of engagement and says profit maximization, but my interests as a user are different from those of YouTube. And qualitative relevant recommendation don't necessarily need to be personalized. And this is a model that we are following with YouTube. So YouTube is a browser extension which enables users and content creator to gain control back of their YouTube recommendation. So the extension is basically replacing the recommendation directly in the HTML in youtube.com, and it allows users to pick between different recommendation paradigms. So of course, they can still see the default personalized recommendation from YouTube if they choose to, but they can also pick from alternative recommendation engines, as our platform is designed to be interoperable with third-party algorithms. So there are not many options available yet because we actually know of one so far, which is called tournesol.app. It's an effort developed at EPFL. But this is exactly what our conversation is about today, is how do we create the condition for more alternatives to come. And last, on you choose, users can choose to see the recommendations provided directly by the content creator. So content creator can choose what they want to recommend on their own videos. And this model seems to make everyone happier. Content creator gain back agency because they decide what their content should promote. And users see more relevant and less clickbaity content. And they can still see YouTube recommendation if they want to. And so this whole system is operated without collecting any single piece of user data, not even an email address. And so the claims made by the platforms that data-intensive models are the only viable ones are untruthful. The same goes with the business model. YouChoose is a nonprofit so far supported by grants, including the EU Horizon 2020, but there are various self-resilient business models which are possible. For instance, donation and freemium. But the most promising one is to rely on sponsored recommendation, very similar to what Facebook, YouTube are doing. And because the recommendation can be placed at the video level, it's easy to target them to a very specific audience, which makes them valuable too, just like native advertisement with influencers. And moreover, YouChoose enables to link recommendation outside of YouTube. So it doesn't restrict the platform to in a closed environment. And the BBC, for instance, would be willing to pay quite a lot of money to place recommendation on their own YouTube content, which redirects users to the video player on their own website, where they control all the ad revenues. And so it has a side benefit to also drive audience away from monopolistic platforms and inverts the usual dynamics, which usually bring users from all around the web to YouTube and then traps them in this closed ecosystem.
Thank you so much for addressing that key issue, which is money, how to fund that. I hear you, and I do agree that we need to be courageous in suggesting non-profit business models rather than running on commercial gains, because running on commercial gains might inevitably sooner or later lead to advertising, which is what brought us to that hard place where we are today. But I wonder, and this is opening for everybody who wants to comment, not only Mark, how can we prevent that through the unbundling explained by Maria Luisa and opening the market? We might have to deal with less ethical actors who might even offer something very similar to YouChoose.ai, but without that strong ethics behind it, and will simply continue with this surveillance-driven advertising model or simply tracking their users. How can we prevent that we won't achieve more of the same evil that we have now with Facebook and large platforms through opening that market?
I mean, if I can say, one thing is already that having for user to have choice should let them also take what is better for them. The problem is that today users don't have a choice. So they are forced to take this data exploitative model, which is not necessarily tailored to their need. But if there is if we open the market, there should be various ethical actors to pick from, and if users have a choice to get a better one, I think they would probably go for it.
Yeah, another concept could be a regulator in that space, making sure that we do have standards that forbid or prevent that race to the bottom from repeating basically in the same space, the same or new, because that time it would be open, interoperable space where other business models can compete for users' money eventually. I do believe that people might also be ready to pay for such services, but also users' attention. I already used the keyword standards and users choosing different models, different services. I'm turning to Corey because I know that you are very interested in opening that space. You have published, both EFF and yourself published on interoperability, on basically creating old internet in this environment dominated by large platforms. So coming back to where we started with internet being free space for business models, for people to express and access information, what are the barriers in your opinion, and how to open that space again?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about that. I actually thought that you were going to ask me about privacy here, but
it is a problem on my list. It is a problem on my list.
Okay.
But I thought that maybe we can start with
sure.
the
No, I'm happy to do that.
And how
I just want to
open the space first.
I just wanted to make sure we were on the right page. So I think that when we talk about tech platforms, we tend to realize the role that network effects play. All tech platforms since the year dot have enjoyed network effects. I mean, people joined MySpace because MySpace had their friends on it. And once they had joined, other people joined to talk to them. People bought Microsoft operating system based computers because there were a lot of Word files out there that they could read with them. And then once they bought them, they created more Word files. That was a reason for other people to buy Microsoft computers. And so the question isn't whether network effects drive scale. They certainly do. The question is, why has the scale been so sticky? How is it that all these other platforms were effectively leaky buckets where users came in and users left? And now it seems like the leaks have been plugged. And I think the answer is that the switching costs have gone up. When Microsoft dominated the Office environment, the real problem with going to a Mac was that the Microsoft Office version for the Mac OS was very bad. I was a CIO back then, and our designers just couldn't talk to the accountants because they would send them a Word file and it would just be immediately corrupted and no one could ever read it again. And the way that and so that meant that there was a very high switching cost, right? If you were to leave the Windows ecosystem, you would leave behind the ability to collaborate with everyone else who was in that ecosystem. And the way that Apple resolved that switching cost conundrum was with interoperability. Steve Jobs commissioned some of his engineers to reverse engineer the Office file formats and made the iWork suite, Pages and Numbers and Keynote, programs that many of you have probably used and certainly you've exchanged documents with. And those could just read and write Microsoft Office files. And once that was the case, you could leave Windows behind without losing the benefits of Windows. You could remain in collaboration with Windows users. Likewise, when Facebook opened to the public and stopped being just for university students, they had this problem that everyone who wanted to use social media already had a MySpace account and all their friends were there. And rather than try to organize like an everybody quit MySpace day, where you and all your friends would solve some impossible collective action problem, you'd all leave next Wednesday at 3 p.m. Instead, they just made a bot. And you could give it your MySpace login and password, and it would go to MySpace and it would scrape your waiting messages, put them in your Facebook inbox, and then reply to them and push them back out to MySpace so that you could leave without all your friends going, and you could do it without losing your friends. So today, if you wanted to make iOS, but a compatible system that could read and write files from the App Store, read and write iTunes files, and so on, Apple would reduce you to a radioactive crater. They'd sue you for circumvention under Article 6 of the European Copyright Directive of 2001. They would sue you for tortious interference with contract. They would bring up cybersecurity issues and so on. And likewise, if you were to try and open up Facebook the way Facebook opened up MySpace, they would sue you too. In fact, we know they would because they've done it. They did it to a company called Power Ventures, which they rendered extinct. And they're doing it now with legal threats to a company called Friendly Browser. So if we are to address the power of these big firms, we need to make it easier to leave. We need to make it cost less to leave, because it's pretty clear when you talk to Facebook users that none of the stuff in the Facebook papers, the Facebook files, is a revelation to them. Facebook users don't like Facebook. They like their friends, and their friends are stuck on Facebook. And their friends are stuck on Facebook because they're there, and they're stuck on Facebook because their friends are there. It's a kind of mutual hostage taking. And the way that we free the hostages is by creating interoperability. And we can do that with things like the Digital Markets Act that might order companies to open up their APIs. It might order them to open up to alternative app stores and so on. And we can also do it by enabling the kind of informal interoperability, what we call competitive compatibility or adversarial interoperability at the Electronic Frontier Foundation that Apple engaged in and Facebook engaged in and even Microsoft engaged in its early days as a way of releasing people from the walled gardens they'd been trapped in by earlier actors. And we do that by doing things like we could have our governments say that they will only procure technologies from firms that promise not to attack interoperators. We could do it by having settlements in antitrust cases come with a covenant, a condition not to use these powers against interoperators or a special master who oversees it. And we could even do it in law by creating affirmative defenses in law, as the Chinese Cyberspace Security Authority has just done, where you are allowed to interoperate and firms are not allowed to block your interoperability, provided you do so within the contours of other law. It really says something when the Chinese Cyberspace Security is racing ahead of the European Union or the United States government in safeguarding the rights of its users. And so, I think that both of these work together very well. And I'll finish by coming back to that example I gave at the beginning of Apple and the iWork suite. Before the iWork suite, Microsoft bent heaven and earth to make it very hard to interoperate with Microsoft's Office formats. They were obfuscated, they were complex, and they changed all the time. Once the iWork suite came along, once there was a kind of guerrilla warfare measure that comprehensively trounced Microsoft and made it so that anyone using a Mac could communicate with Microsoft users, the walled garden was torn down. Microsoft just stopped trying to maintain it. It became solely a cost center and not a profit center. And that's when Microsoft standardized the Office formats. That's where we get PPTX and DocX and SLXX, these XML-based Microsoft Office file formats that are now the thing that we rely on for Google Docs and LibreOffice and so on. And so if you want standards, sometimes the way that you get recalcitrant dominant firms to the table to create a standard is by making it so that maintaining proprietary technologies doesn't confer an advantage, by allowing third parties to break down those proprietary barriers. And that's when it makes sense to cooperate.
Thanks for already a deep dive in technological aspect of that game, what needs to change and what promises there are with interoperability. So before we come back, we do come back to how to ensure human rights standards and privacy in this environment. I know Maria Luisa will speak on it. I know you will speak on it. I will invite that. I want to give floor to Ian Brown to go deeper in the standards question and in the technology question. Ian, what are the technical preconditions for that new interoperable environment to basically run well? Do we need full protocol interoperability? Do we need EU to standardize that space or somebody else to create new technological standards? And how realistic is that we will achieve it?
I think there are a range of options, and I think this is fortunate given that the Digital Services Act in particular is now quite a way through the legislative process. I don't think I, nor Corey, nor anyone else on the panel is about to jump up and down and say there needs to be a whole new section or set of articles in the DSA. I think what the Parliament has been debating in the Digital Services Act, and amendments also to the Digital Markets Act is perfectly good for what we need. I think also you can set high-level requirements in legislation, and then it's very common, of course, in regulation to delegate to the European Commission or to other regulators or technical standards bodies the abilities to work out the details later. You can follow the model Corey was talking about, competitive compatibility. Actually, that sounds for now like the model that Mark is making use of with his service. He's not relying on a specific API that YouTube has been required to create and let his service subscribe to it. He's just hacking the web page. He's hacking the HTML and replacing YouTube's recommender system with his own. What often happens, and Corey's written a lot of great stuff about this in the past, sometimes you get a bit of an arms race. You know, YouTube might say Mark's system became really successful. YouTube might wake up to this and decide, well, this is taking users away from our service. We don't like this. We're going to start fighting back with various technical and legal measures. And I think that's the point when legal requirements or regulatory requirements on giant companies like Alphabet, which of course owns Google and hence YouTube, to allow small companies like Mark's, or maybe even big companies, big competitors, ways to make use of their services in a standardized way. That could be, there's a range of models there. That could be, US legislators have talked in the past about saying, okay, we'll just say in law that the largest companies have to create open APIs, tell everyone how to use them, give them notice if they're going to change them. That might be enough in some circumstances, but you can go further. And I think that's particularly appropriate in areas like social networks where, you know, Facebook is not brand new technology these days. Clearly, this is decades old technology. There are standards for social networks, which I think it could be appropriate for the European Commission being very, very specific to identify and say, Facebook, you must comply with this technical standard, open up your service to competitors. There are various models which I think you can use to fit the different contexts we have. The final thing I would say is that one thing I think is really interesting about ESA's model of unbundling recommender systems. You could see Facebook being unbundled in two ways from a DMA versus DSA perspective. You could say through the Digital Markets Act, Facebook might be required to open up its services to competitors. So Facebook users, like Corey said, could escape to a competitor that was maybe more privacy focused, more freedom of expression focused. And one of the things the competitor could do is have different recommender systems to Facebook and to show users their timeline based on different algorithms as Facebook used. So that would be a sort of, the hostage the hostages escaping from the mothership in Corey's terms. But I think also in the DSA, there's a really interesting opportunity very specifically on recommender systems. The DSA already said in the original text that big companies, very large online platforms, have to give their users options over how the recommender systems work. And I think it would very nicely fit in there. And Kim, sorry, correct me if I'm getting this not precisely right, but I think the Greens and I think others have proposed exactly those amendments to the DSA to say for recommender systems specifically, then very large online platforms must enable users to choose from competitors' recommender systems. And I think actually that would reach a lot more people initially on Facebook than might be willing at first to take, to make the step to a completely different platform, even if from that new platform, they were still able to stay in contact with their friends on Facebook.
Indeed, this is, I think, a far more promising solution in the short term. And just to clarify, for that latter solution to work, would we need a new technical standard in operation that is not yet created? Or you could imagine that actually this is the standard that is already used by large platforms, only it would need to be improved or maybe prevented from excluding competition. But the technology is more or less in place?
I think this very specific piece of technology, I think, unlike social media platforms as a whole, where the World Wide Web Consortium, for example, has a quite mature technical standard now called activity streams, which Mastodon, a number of other competitor services use. Millions of people use that standard. On alternative recommender systems, there isn't such a mature, available technical standard. So I think it would be perfectly appropriate for the DSA to sort of set some high-level rules, delegate the details to the Commission, and then the Commission, in the kind of dialogue that's foreseen in the DMA and the DSA, the Commission can talk to the large online platforms itself, but of course also, but critically, to their competitors, to civil society, to other people that want to have a voice in what that technology should look like as it develops.
Mm-hmm. I do like that plan. Kim, would you like to quickly comment on the proposition filed by Greens, or we keep it for later?
Well, I could quickly comment, because indeed this is the proposal we did. We think it should be opened up, and that's also the amendments we have put forward. We're still in the middle of the negotiations, and yeah, we're still hoping, of course, that this is something that will be included, specifically for the very large online platforms. But yeah, we don't know yet. The negotiations are tough. There's a lot of noise. That's why I'm also really happy we're having this meeting and this event today. There's a lot of noise, of course, coming from the companies that have so carefully built their walled garden to make sure that you can't get away anymore. Yeah, it's going to be very interesting to see what happens.
Mm-hmm. I see Łukasz Klejnowski from the participants list with a hand up. Is it something on the proposal we are discussing right now, or that comment can wait until we open Q&A?
It's up to you. Questions and one comment. So I can. Okay. What should I do now?
Let's park it for 10 minutes more. We will open the discussion soon. I do promise. It is our plan. I just want to make sure that before we do so, we come back to the very important question of human rights, privacy, data security standards in that new environment. Now, I think the speakers have explained how technically could that happen, how the unbundle can be done using technical standards, and what is the promise behind it. Now, let's talk briefly before we open for the Q&A about the problems and the risks, because clearly there will be problems with every revolution, with every deep change. There are problems, and one of the most recurring one in the debate is privacy. How can we ensure that these new players do respect GDPR? How do we ensure that they do not repeat the same surveillance-driven business model, even advertising something else? I already posed a question, and Mark partly responded, referring to users' own choices and simply competition as something to regulate that. I do think it is one of the good answers, but maybe we have other approaches as well. There is Maria Luisa and Corey on that topic. Maybe Maria, you go first.
Yes, thanks. Well, actually, because then Corey is going to cover this, I think I'm going to concentrate not necessarily on privacy specifically, but on human rights standards and on free expression, because this is what I feel more familiar with. I do believe that we need to make clear one thing. This idea of opening up the market and having a decentralized and diversified environment, it doesn't really change anything about the need that we do have for those services to be provided in compliance with our data protection framework and our human rights framework. What I'm trying to say is that there is a difference in between the fact that we need to invent new rules, or the fact that we need to properly enforce what we have. I do believe that we do have already human rights standards that we can definitely apply, we shall apply to the way we provide content curation. I do believe that we have a lot of media rules and policies that will tell us, for example, that exposure of diversity is very good for democracy, and that this needs to be applied in those services that have an impact on this layer. So what I think is that even if we open up the market, it needs to remain absolutely clear that each and every player that steps in is obliged to respect those standards. So we're not opening the gate to everything and everyone to do whatever they want, but we're opening the gate for new players to play by the rules, and those rules they need to apply across providers. I am sure that Corey can build on that specifically for what concerns privacy.
Well, I think that's for the same. Corey, over to you.
I think that's very well said. And I would add a couple of things in relation to it. So the European Union is better situated than most to enable third-party platforms to interoperate with dominant ones, because it already has a freestanding privacy law. I mean, leaving aside the human rights question for a moment, although I'll return to that. So we actually have an objective metric that we can use to assess the conduct, not just of dominant platforms, but of the ones that arise to sort of pick away at their dominance. And, you know, that's great, because the dominant platforms themselves also need to respect these rules and have done a pretty bad job of doing so, largely, I think, in complicity with sleeping ICOs that are failing to actually process the cases that are brought to them in relation to these big platforms. But you know, that's an enforcement defect, not a defect with the idea of having a freestanding privacy law that establishes a strong consent regime. And you know, if we're going to fix this, we should fix it not by getting rid of the privacy law, but by improving the enforcement mechanism. On to the question of human rights. I want to harken back to something that Ian said, which I think is true, which is that for the median user, a plugin that allows you to use the major platform, but have a different recommender system or some other different moderation systems plugged into it, might be a simpler lift and something that's more attractive than actually taking the step of quitting Facebook or quitting one of the other big services and going somewhere else. But for the users that I think we're most concerned with in the context of human rights, the users who are most subject to harassment, to brigading, specifically, I think, to organized harassment, particularly state-level harassment. If you've ever criticized the Modi regime on Twitter and attracted the Indian Cyber Patriot Army, you know what that's like. Those users are the ones who are most in need of alternative moderation systems and alternative mechanisms for protecting users. And those users are the ones who would benefit most from going somewhere else. And, you know, it's worth asking then, why is it that these users that face this high risk of harassment and of brigading and other threats to their human rights, why are they still on these giant platforms if they're such a toxic environment for them? And I think there we have to understand that the platforms have a high degree of salience for people that from moment to moment overwhelms the negative cost of using them. That, you know, if you're a creator or someone involved in politics or human rights or campaigning, that it's very hard to absent yourself from these large platforms. And one of the things that having smaller platforms that plug into them would do is allow you to remain part of the conversation without having to rely on the platform deciding that your use case is worth addressing in its moderation policies. And then to return to the last intervention, we do need enforcement on these smaller platforms too. And I can already hear people saying, well, how, if we can't even enforce against Facebook and Google and Twitter, these giant targets that are so big that you can see them from orbit, how are we going to police micro platforms? And it's true, we might fail to police some of these micro platforms to the degree that we would like to police these big ones. But what goes on those micro platforms isn't as important as what goes on in the big ones, because if you're on a micro platform where you're being harassed, it's a lot easier to leave that micro platform and go to another one with better moderation policies, which is not to say that we should go to sleep on the platforms that tolerate human rights abuses, but that if we're going to miss a human rights abuse, if we're going to downrank one for immediate enforcement, the one that users can leave most easily and go somewhere else without incurring a real penalty, those are the ones that we actually do want to make the bottom of our priority list, because we offer those users an alternative remedy.
Thank you for that. Let me dig deeper into other problems that could either be intensified or arrive as new as something novel for us when we create open interoperable ecosystem in the place of currently closed advertising driven one, where there is at least one simple profit making model and the array of problems is, so to say, constrained by the business logic of the platform. If we move on to alternative recommender systems, wouldn't people land in the situation when there is much higher likelihood of being locked in the rabbit holes, locked in their own filter bubbles, because they will be able to calibrate the online reality exactly to their preferences and simply avoid being confronted, be that for business purposes or any other purposes, with something they might not like so much. How about this problem? There is also a set of problems signaled by one of our participants, Julius. I'm reading the question now. If we open recommender systems, what could be negative side effects resulting in even more problems such as hate speech, propaganda, difficulty in content moderation? Who could speak to that? Mark, could you maybe start with addressing this as you address it in You Choose AI?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, to me, this is a matter of intentionality. I think that if you have a user who has the intention to go on a rabbit hole and to only read, say, conspiratorial content, there's not much you can do about that. And if it's not going to be, if that person's not going to explore that content on YouTube, it's going to be on other websites. So this possibility already exists. The problem with the current system is that a lot of users end up in these rabbit holes without even noticing it and without having the intention to go there. And I think this is where alternative recommender systems have a potentially can offer better alternatives, because the current systems are already kind of tailored to really drive up engagement, and therefore the most sensationalist or polarizing content tend to be promoted. But not all alternative systems have to abide by the same dynamics.
Maria Luisa, you want to add on this?
Well, yeah, I can add a couple of points. One, I think I can build on what Corey said earlier, which is we need to consider also a matter of impacts, right? So we might have problems with the other recommended systems as well, but the point is, if we do have hate speech on a platform like Facebook, it's going to be seen by an enormous amount of people. If we have it in a small platform, it's going to be seen by less people. And then this is already, per se, a sort of a mitigation risk. Also, if we keep those platforms those services very open, and people are able to switch and change every time they want, I see this as another major advantage. It's not. There is also another consideration that I would like to share, is that if we think about a counterfactual, so the current situation doesn't work. What we're trying to suggest is a possible different scenario where things might be improved per se by the diversification and decentralization of the environment. If we stay with concentrated power, the only solution we have is to go for ever more intrusive sort of monitoring of the content. If we really want to get rid of every hate speech that we're going to see online in a concentrated environment, the tendency there, the risk there, is that we are going to be seduced by the idea of controlling everything. And if we only have 3 platforms, it's easier to control 3 platforms than 30 platforms or 30 players, sorry, because we're talking about a diversified environment of recommended systems here. But is this what we want for our democracy? Do we really want, general monitoring of and a few channels for this general monitoring to function effectively? I wouldn't say so. I wouldn't see this fitting in our democratic environment. So I think what we're offering here is one of the best solutions that we have at the moment.
Kim, would you like to come in on the same problem?
Well, I think what is very important when we're talking about enforcement, we see already that there's a lack of funding and a lack of capacity, right? And a lack of expertise. And I think what is very important, because we are now in this rule setting phase, and we're going to create new rules. We're going to create rules for, the way we have to moderate, the way we have to check on whether algorithmic systems are, tackling fundamental rights and make sure that those are being respected online. I think it's very crucial that we're then also thinking about who will enforce that. And one of the proposals that my group has done for the Digital Services Act is that there will be a European authority which is co-funded by digital platforms. And the idea is that it will work similarly as the banking system, where it's also the case that the biggest banks pay the most money for their own oversight. And I think this would be a system that could be very useful to make sure that we have the right enforcement, and that will also create less fear of creating more competition and creating more possibilities for organizations, because then we know we have the right enforcement in place. So I think and really hope as well that this solution will be taken on board in the Digital Services Act.
Thank you so much. We share these hopes as organizers of this event, and not hiding our agenda. Talking about hopes in the European Parliament, I think now is a good time to officially open the Q&A for more discussion. And I will invite a comment from Łukasz Kajnowski, an advisor of the EPP group at the European Parliament. Łukasz, it is your time to speak. There is probably unmuting going on. Can you hear us?
Hi.
Hi.
Do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thanks for giving me the floor. Thanks for organizing this, Kasia. It's the only thing is we're not anymore in the EPP. So I'm working with Róża Thun, and she moved recently to the Renew group. So the EPP is not longer is not longer valid, but there's no problem. Most of the time we work with the EPP, so I just have 3 questions, comments. So I'll try to be go already to it. So first of all, I think the idea of the alternative systems, alternative recommender system, is a very interesting one, and it's great that it has been proposed within the discussion on the DSA, DMA. Although I have one major doubt on it, whether it is if we set some rules here and ask the Commission to develop the standards, whether the Commission will really be able to do it, whether they will be they have enough competence in order to create it and make it happen, and make it in a way that it will be really suitable for the market and for the society. So what was mentioned is that they can have conversations with the big platforms. I'm not sure if this would be really helpful, because this would be counterproductive for the platform to cooperate on it. Not sure if it's feasible. So this is the main question on the feasibility of and the capability of the European Commission to do it. Second issue is it was raised by Corey also, but Ian, you refer to DSA, to DMA. So my question is, what is the level of this regulation? Should it be only for the big platform? Is this problem of not getting enough choice for consumers? Is it only with Facebook or other big players, or should it be regulated lower, like in DSA? DMA is if it's only big, then we say very, very big, we say DMA. But if we're talking about DSA, then we should probably know better whether we want to have only very large online platforms, or also at lower level. And if we make this choice, I think we need to also see how feasible is that, and how feasible it is for these companies, because I mean, obviously, to me, the idea of the alternative recommender systems means that we are taking a rather big one stream of revenues for some companies. So the question is, I mean, we are doing this for the public good, and this argumentation, I think I can understand, but I'm not sure if on every level this would be justified. So this is the second question. The third one is it's rather a disagreement with what I think Ian was saying this about the harassment example. I really don't think that running away from harassment is a solution to other, not profiled or profiled in different way by different alternative recommender systems. I think the solution should be to fight with the incitement, with violence, and bringing the people who do it to court or to some authorities. So I don't. Frankly speaking, I don't buy an argument that this is a solution for harassment, unless I didn't understand you properly. But I mean, I think there is a rationale to have alternative systems, but I don't think that this rationale is that this could be a solution for harassment. Thank you.
Thank you for saying this and asking pointy questions. Ian, over to you.
Good questions. No, I agree with you very much. I'm not suggesting the European Commission themselves should be writing these kind of technical standards. They would be delegated with the responsibility of organizing the production of standards that were needed, but they would do that. There are different models. They could do that by asking one of the European standardization bodies, ETSI, for example, to develop that technical standard. I think in the broader social media interoperability debate, as I said, there's already a very good W3C standard. So the Commission could choose to say, we will require gatekeepers to comply with this particular standard. The Commission could, so this is the model actually the US Access Act, which has been proposed by the House of Representatives Antitrust Subcommittee, uses. The Commission could set up a technical committee with representatives from the covered platform, from its competitors, from civil society, from the Commission, and then it would be a requirement for the committee to develop the technical standard. That's another way of doing it. A third model, as I mentioned, with something relatively novel like alternative recommender systems, the Commission could simply require a very large online platform to open up an API or to create an API that met certain tests, to give access to all of the needed documentation to competitors to make use of it, to notify competitors before changing it. There are various different kinds of conditions you could put in place. On your question of which platforms should be covered, should it be only the very largest gatekeepers in the DMA? VLOP is very large online platforms. I think uses the same user number of 45 million, but without the market capitalization and business user criteria from the DMA. So I think you can debate that. I don't think that's a key aspect of it. I think you actually partly answered the question yourself when you went on to talk about the costs to covered platforms, perhaps in terms of loss of advertising revenue, certainly in terms of compliance costs. This is not something that's completely cost-free, and I think that's one reason from a proportionality perspective, it is appropriate to say we the European Parliament and the co-legislators, it's appropriate to put those requirements on the very largest platforms. When you look at many digital markets today, not only social media, but they're a prime example of this, you often see one very large platform and then much smaller competitors. That's true of social networks, that's true of instant messaging, it's true of a number of other gatekeeper platforms. So I think we're not trying to draw fine gradations here. We're not saying we'll cover these three, but not this fourth and fifth social media platform. We're saying, as we see that market today, and as for structural reasons that market is likely to remain we're talking about one gigantic, ultra-dominant firm in the Court of Justice's latest term. And that's the one that clearly would be the target for proportionate regulatory action. Your third question, it was actually Corey, so I'll hand over to Corey.
Corey, over to you.
Oh, thank you, Ian. I think that in order to really understand the framework for answering these questions, we have to ask ourselves what competition is for. And I think there's a kind of fetishization of competition as a mechanism by which the invisible hand of the market just creates optimal outcomes. And I think that that's the wrong frame. At EFF, our guiding principle has always been that we fight for the user, and we want users to have technological self-determination. And we care about competition when it delivers that, and we don't care about competition when it doesn't. So, you know, when the Competition and Markets Authority in the UK sits down and says, well, we have a problem with ad tech because only Google and Facebook can do attribution, which is where after you see an ad on the internet, they follow you around both on the internet and in the physical world and gather all of your payment data and figure out whether or not you bought the thing you saw the ad for. And they conclude that the problem with this is that it's not democratic enough, and that smaller firms should also be able to spy on you in the same way. And then the CMA goes on to propose that everyone be issued a lifelong advertising identifier that haunts them until the end of their days. And, you know, if all you care about is competition, that might make sense. But if you care about technological self-determination, it's an abomination. And so, you know, the question of when and who is forced to open up and under what circumstances is much easier to answer when you couch it in those terms. So to get into specifics, you know, I think that we could have something like the Access Act, where we say to these very large firms, these gatekeeper firms that have been identified already by European supranational authorities, we could say to them, you must stand up an API or open up in some other way. And in order to avoid the pitfall of ossification, which is a problem that standardization advocates worry about a lot, where you standardize something and then improvements come along and you can't make the improvement because it breaks the standard, we can make that standard, rather than a mandate, we can make it a safe harbor. So we can say, as Ian just said, we require you to allow these kinds of interoperability, alternative recommender systems, for example. And if you use this standard that we have developed here, you will automatically be adjudged to be in compliance with this, with the regulation, which means that smaller firms have very low compliance costs. However, if you do anything else that satisfies these criteria, then you are also in compliance. So it allows for both standardization and flexibility. It's much more future-proofed. In terms of smaller firms, you know, I don't think that there's the same concern about smaller firms because they don't have hostages, right? That's the thing that I think we try to address with Interop is this hostage-taking situation. We try to lower their switching costs. But that's not to say that we shouldn't reestablish the broad principle in law and practice that people should be allowed to adapt the technologies they use so they suit them better, which is something that was absolutely standard and is latent in the history of every great technology firm that operates in Europe and America and around the world today, and which has lately been extinguished by dominant firms that have either established new law or new interpretation of existing law to make it impossible to do unto them what they did unto their predecessors. And so reestablishing that would be a good across the board, irrespective of whether we're talking about small firms, including things like user co-ops and nonprofits, or very large multinationals, because it's, you know, anyone who's ever been in a co-op knows that it's possible for co-ops to be very toxic indeed. The fact that it's run as a co-op doesn't mean that the people who are running it won't do things that are detrimental to your interests. And so we don't want people being taken hostage by those either.
Thank you. Thank you for coming back to the hostage metaphor. I think it's necessary that we understand our condition, how dire and desperate it is, and how much really we have to change that. I will come back to the other model where people stay on the platform but are offered much higher control and choice. And I want to bring for the discussion the concept of open API, as maybe something in between a full technical standard offering full protocol interoperability and what we have now, something maybe where European Commission could play a role. And I'm looking at Mark for a follow-up on this, but at the same time, I want to send a signal to our excellent audience that these are the last 10 minutes for you to ask a question or make a quick comment. So be mindful. Mark, what do you think about Open API and the European Commission's role in this?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as Corey and Jana were mentioning, there are ways you can do in an adversarially interoperable way, which is what we're doing with YouTube. But then you can only use public content, and you need to scrape it yourself and parse it. And for example, Facebook is intentionally obfuscating their HTMLs to make it harder to detect and isolate content and detect ads. So if legislation could ensure proper interoperability, we could do much more and on all the platforms. And so what should be required for this is to impose that platform have APIs returning content in a machine readable way, unfiltered, to allow for the content management and filtering to be performed on the client side or by a third party of their choice. And here we can see also that in terms of privacy, it's also beneficial because the filtering happens on the client side. So and so you don't need to have as much data, personal data held by the platforms. So the API should, for example, enable to specify which content should be contained in this raw feed, for instance, including parameters such as date range or a set of sources. And the content should also be enriched with metadata to enable the filtering, and this metadata should follow a standard nomenclature. And I mean, a lot of the metadata which the platform own come in fact from the users in the first place, like the hashtags, for example. For now a decade, platforms have relied on the crowdsourced efforts to train their hashtags enrichment algorithms. And so then with this paradigm, we could apply algorithmic filters which the user can pick as they want. And it's a pretty versatile paradigm which could enable a multitude of alternatives to traditional feeds and new ways to curate and explore content.
Thank you. I see in the discussion we have the problem of alternative recommender systems failing at providing higher quality content coming back. Can we, towards the end of our discussion, repeat the arguments, maybe summarizing them? Why do you believe that actually alternative recommender systems should not repeat the same problem that we see now with commercial advertising-driven recommender systems when it comes to amplification of toxic content? Are there any internal intrinsic safeguards against that, or are we simply counting on users' control here or users' preferences being simply different than amplifying toxic content? Where is the safeguard here, if there is one? Anybody able to summarize that argument that was expressed before, but maybe in a more complex form?
Maybe I can give it a go. Just the first go, very quick, so everyone else can build on top. I think there are three main reasons here. The first one is that if we empower users, then users are going to be able to make choices and pick the recommended system that they feel more at ease with. So most of us hopefully will pick the one that amplifies less toxic content and provides the content that we are more inclined to see, each of us, or to look for, each of us, depending on our interests and attitudes. So this is the empowerment of users, having finally users being part of this game, I think is a huge, huge game changer. The second one is, if we open up the market, there will be competition. So every player is going to feel competitive pressure from the other players. And this, as so many times in so many different sectors, and thankfully so, has led to innovation and to the provision of a better quality. So if players are under competitive pressure, they're stimulated, they have incentives to provide something which is better and not worse off than other what's existing or what's provided by others. Those are the main two drivers that I would say are completely absent in the environment we live now today. And those are exactly the two kind of incentives, the two kind of drivers that the bundled as a strategy adopted by the very large online platforms, or the large platforms, is exactly a strategy to shield them from those two drivers. To maintain the status quo. The third one, which I think is also important, is that as I mentioned before, we're not opening up the market for players to do whatever they want. We still need, and the DSA contains them, we still need human rights standards for the provision of these services. So what we are asking for, and what we plan and we hope is, and what is our proposal about, is a cumulative instrument. Something that we need together with human rights standard for these activities, not as an alternative.
We are in 5 last minutes of the discussion, so this is probably the time for short summaries and your main takeaways or your legacy for the European Parliament working on the key legislation that can solve this problem. I see Mark and Corey with their hands up. Mark, you go first.
Mine was, thank you. Just very quickly, another reason why alternative recommender system may not bring as much toxic content is that the current systems are designed to maximize engagement on the platform. And this is why this incentive, which creates a lot of the toxicity. Alternative recommender systems might not have the same incentive, and they might not be here just to keep user watching.
Corey, last comments, ideas, legacies?
Sure. I mean, I think that final question really dovetails nicely into the theme of this, which is a question about whether the reason platforms are unpleasant places to be is because of something related to their design or something related to the human condition. If people are hanging around on platforms that make them really unhappy, even when it's easy to change, then I think at that point, maybe we say it's not making them unhappy. And maybe the thing that we're calling toxic is just something about us as people. I'm kind of an optimist about the human condition. I do take it as read that if people are in a place that makes them unhappy and you can show them how to leave, they will. And I think that the reason that Facebook is so unpleasant is because of the way Facebook is designed, not because Facebook users are flawed vessels who are irredeemable. And I think that if the hypothesis is instead that maybe there's something we can do with machine learning that turns ordinary people into beasts, and that every platform might figure out how to hook us by using machine learning to make us into people who are unpleasant to be around online, then that thesis needs a lot more development, because I think it cites a lot of facts not in evidence. You know, everyone who ever claimed that they could control our minds turned out to be either lying to us or lying to themselves, from, you know, Rasputin to the CIA. And Facebook may claim this when they talk to advertisers and promise that they can sell us stuff that we don't even want. But I think it's just far more likely that the reason Facebook is unpleasant is because we're all corralled in there. And I think that if we all end up somewhere else or lots of other places and we're still unpleasant to one another, that maybe we don't have a technology problem. Maybe at that point we do say we have a problem with our civilization.
I hear you. I share that. Ian, what is your final argument or comment for today?
2 brief points. I think that something Frances Haugen did get very right, as has already been mentioned, is a lot of these problems would greatly be improved by human scale communities and content moderation. I think there's a lot of potential in that, and interoperability lets you have that while still keeping the benefits of scale, of people being able to talk to lots of other friends and family and colleagues on different networks. They're no longer stuck on the one giant network. My final thought is I've spent a lot of time over the last 18 months talking to to first people in the European Commission and then people in the European Parliament about this. And I think there are a lot of good arguments in favor of interoperability. There are some important questions, and we've discussed a number of them today, to which I think there are good answers. And the intensity of the pushback that we've been getting from the very largest tech companies that would be affected, to me, is actually a positive sign that this is something they realize could really shake things up. So that's why I hope Kim and her colleagues will keep really fighting hard for this.
Kim, we are all looking at you, and there is a very good question directly to you. How can people help? So tell us your final comments.
Yes, thank you. And I think it's a great question. How can we, push this narrative better? And I think, as I said, also in the beginning, one of the things that, is very much resonating, unfortunately, in the parliament is this whole idea of any rules or regulations will create a graveyard of startups and SMEs, and no one will ever be able to come up with anything anymore. And I think we really have to make sure that the politicians who believe in that narrative understand that as long as these very big platforms don't share their space, basically, and they will only start doing that when we force them to do that, then these small tech SMEs and startups will never stand a chance. So I think that is the narrative we have to push. That's what we have to explain. If we want to create European champions, which is something that for a lot of politicians is the core of the DMA now, trying to get rid of the big Silicon Valley scary platforms and create European champions, we have to give them the opportunity to become bigger, to get the space that these very large online platforms are now taking on the internet. And I think if we can get that message across, there is a lot of hope to change the internet as it is right now.
Thank you so much. We are getting this message across. Today was one of the many attempts, and certainly not the last one. As organizers of this webinar, we can confirm our commitment. Panoptykon Foundation, Access Now, Article 19, European Partnership for Democracy. We all thank you for participation. Excellent mix of speakers, excellent audience, and well, let's continue the debate, because this is too important to be abandoned by us. Even if not this time, we will continue the fight for open internet. Thank you so much, Katarzyna Szymilewicz, and yeah, see you on other occasion.